Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Lee Maracle, whom I'm reading out of Native Poetry in Canada. So a lot of Maracle's poetry deals with these sort of interstitial spaces of identity. So in some instances, that reflects Maracle's own heritage, right? So a poem like War deals with both her Métis heritage, which is an intermixing of typically French and Indigenous First Nations Canadians, in this case Cree, but she's also Salish, which is a West Coast nation, whereas the Métis tend to be more a sort of plains people generally. I believe the Métis nation is primarily in, I want to say places like Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, but I'm not 100% sure of that. That's my general sense of it. But it is these sort of blended identities, right? So we have that element where it's a question of identity as such, but we also have a sort of broader issue of how Indigenous people exist within settler colonial societies. In settler colonial societies like the United States and Canada, where Maracle is actually from, English, or to a lesser extent French, have been imposed upon Indigenous peoples. These are not the native languages of North America, but many of the native languages of North America have been either severely reduced or entirely destroyed through colonialism. Indigenous ways of storytelling have been replaced by Western literary traditions. Issues of ethics, worldviews, politics, economics, social organization, power within societies, etc., etc. All of these things Indigenous peoples had their own various ways of doing, right? And different nations, tribes, and bands had different approaches to these things. But many of those have been, in some cases, completely eliminated, right? You think about the Indigenous peoples of the East Coast, places like New Brunswick or Newfoundland. Newfoundland may be a bad example because I think the Indigenous people there have maintained some of their culture, but places like Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, Georgia, these places along the East Coast that have been settled by European colonists for a long, long time. There's been an almost complete destruction of many of those cultures. And for the descendants of those cultures who survived, it has often involved the imposition of Western languages, Western cultures, Western ways of looking at the world. And so that means capitalism, that means from a settler colonial perspective, that means privileging European literary traditions, etc., etc. And Maracle takes issue with a lot of these things. So I'm actually going to start with the poem War because that is one of the ones that's more sort of directly concerned with heritage as such, as opposed to cultural issues, which, at least in the poems selected in this collection, Maracle seemed more interested in the problems of culture than of heritage. But this poem, War, deals with sort of the challenges of reconciling competing histories, competing identities, competing traditions, etc., etc. So this is war. In my body flows the blood of Gallic Bastille stormers and the soft, gentle ways of Salish Cree womanhood. Deep-throated bass tones dissipate, swallowed by the earth. Uproarious laughter sears, mutilates my voice. Child of the earth tear of the west coast rain. Earth tear. Child of the earth tear of the west coast rain. Dewdrop sparkling in the crisp, clear sun of my home. Warm woman of the Mediterranean sunscape, bleaching rough cotton sweatshop anniversary, thunderous rude earthquakes that split my spirit within, tiny grapes of wine console me. Can I deny a heritage blackened by the toil of billions conceived in rape, plunder, and butchery, in the veins that fight to root themselves in the wondrous breath of my homeland, races the blood of base humanity? European thief, liar, bloodsucker, I deny you not, I fear you not. Your reality and mine no longer rankles me. I am moved by my love for human life, by the firm conviction that all the world must stop the butchery, stop the slaughter. I am moved by my scars, by my own filth, to rewrite history with my body, to shed the blood of those that betray themselves. To life, world, humanity, I ascribe to my people, my history, I address my vision. So, there's clearly an anti-colonial, anti-racist aspect of this poem, right? This sort of idea of my identity combines these different histories, different heritages, that are often seen as diametrically opposed to one another. But what we must do is move beyond that idea of oppositions and find in ourselves and in one another our common humanity. And we build a better world through that identification of and with common humanity. But again, most of Maracle's poems, at least again in this collection, deal more with issues of culture and the cultural challenges that come with existing within a settler colonialist society. So Maracle's first poem that she ever wrote, according to the text and her, was called My Box of Letters, and it deals with the issues of the imposition of language on indigenous peoples. So that is, again, a language that is not the language of those indigenous people. It is a language that is foreign. And as people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o talk about, as part of a sort of a particular strand of post-colonial discourse, the imposition of a language is the imposition of a way of thinking about and looking at the world in a way that eliminates or represses that the colonized individual's native way of looking at the world. So My Box of Letters is a really interesting poem because it sort of embodies this struggle with a language that is not one's own and the challenges that come with trying to navigate it. So, this is My Box of Letters. I was only 6 when they forced me to take the box of beastly letters. We were not friends from the start. We resented each other. They tripped over each other in crazy, senseless, and ridiculous patterns. They jumped around me defiantly, higgledy-piggledy and round. They got me in trouble, these mischievous little rascals. They hated me. They said it was because I didn't understand them. I jumped inside the box, grabbed them, and wrestled them down. This didn't work. They fought hard. There were 26 of them, and I was only one. 1991 afterthought on finding this, my first poem saved by my mother. With diligence and persistence, I befriended them. I cajoled them, persuaded them for years to make them behave. So another poem that's in a similar sort of vein about the incongruence between indigenous identity and the ways in which indigenous people perform that identity, or the sort of gap between reality and presentation. So this is performing. I should have gotten an Oscar for all the lies I told, all the masks I wore, but they don't give Indian women Oscars for dressin' like Vogue magazine and drippin' honeyed English. Remember, Ta, I spoke broken English too? Now I am speechless. So I think that one's really, really cool. I really like that poem because it's quite short, and that means it packs a lot of punch, right? There's so much power in this very short exploration of the gap between how indigenous people are asked or required to present themselves within settler, colonialist, and capitalist society versus the, I don't want to say authentic, because I'm as a good postmodernist, I'm skeptical of the idea of authenticity, but between ways of cultural self-presentation that are rooted in indigenous traditions and cultures and worldviews. There is a huge gap between these two. Obviously, there's overlap, there's interconnections. We are human beings, and human beings develop cultures, and those cultures are meant to solve similar problems, and sometimes they will solve them in similar ways, etc., etc. But there are many, many differences between indigenous cultures and European cultures, settler colonialist cultures, and indigenous peoples within settler colonial societies are often implicitly or explicitly coerced into performing those settler colonialist cultural norms. And so this is what this poem is exploring. And again, it does it in a very compact package, a very focused package, and so it works quite well. The last one I'm going to read you of Maracle's poems is Mr. Mandela. And I mean, the title of this obviously sort of points to who this poem is addressed to. And what it's interested in is another actually element that Maracle, that recurs in Maracle's poetry, which is a sort of pan-anti-colonialism, right? So an identification of the anti-colonial indigenous rights movements in North America, in this case with the anti-apartheid struggle of South Africa, represented most canonically by Nelson Mandela. So this is Mr. Mandela. Forgive me, Mr. Mandela, I tried to picture you in prison for 25 years, but a hand closed on my throat. I know this land, it lives in the windowless room of my childhood, a room filled with rats and menacing sounds. A terrifying loneliness seizes my insides, closes my voice, and I don't want to remember. In the dark, eyes shut tight, the memories of an empty belly force themselves to fill the space where thought of you ought to live. The sight of your black face between stark white walls and iron bars draws the drapes on the ray of light left me by 1,000 rain-soaked days. When I look at you in prison, Mr. Mandela, I can't feel the power of Mother Sea, feel the wind of my green mountains, or rise up to resist their demise. I treasure this eagle of resistance, couching you and Leonard in each wing. You shall have to be happy, Mr. Mandela, with my humble tribute. So again, the connection between the poet persona, who presumably in this case is indigenous, although that's not necessarily specified. So the connection between the poet persona, Nelson Mandela, of course, again, the sort of most visible and famous, globally famous symbol of the anti-apartheid struggle, and Leonard Peltier, the indigenous rights activist. This sort of idea of a transcultural, transcontinental prison of racism and of colonialism is what drives this play. And it's a really powerful idea here.